Now, let's take a turn from Alaska to Argentina, where the president is right now. But his mind isn't necessarily there. His mind, especially according to his tweets, are in Washington, as he has fired off tweets from the G20 summit, again slamming the special counsel investigation as a witch hunt. But Robert Mueller and his team remain focused, and I'm going to say unfazed, and leaving the door open to even more charges against former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. At a conference hearing with the case's D.C. judge today, setting a date for Manafort's official sentencing. While in New York, Mueller's latest cooperating witness, the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, he went about his day, not responding to his old boss, calling him weak and not very smart. But Michael Cohen's cooperation with the special counsel helps fill in a whole lot more of the 2016 timeline, showing even more contact between Trump-affiliated people and guess who? Vladimir Putin's underlings. All right, buckle up with me. This is going to be a lot, but it's important. So stick with us as I walk you through the timeline. In January of 2016, Michael Cohen, President Trump's fixer and personal attorney, emailed Vladimir Putin's press secretary looking for help to start the Trump Tower Moscow project. The two played email tag over the next few days, and eventually they got in touch. A week after Cohen first reached out, Felix Sater called him, saying, quote, "It's about Putin. They called today." Then we jump ahead to March, when George Papadopoulos, you remember this guy, the Trump team called him Coffee Boy, he met with a London-based professor in Italy specifically about Russian government connections. Just a few days later, Russian hackers stole Hillary Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta's emails. And just days later, after that, Papadopoulos met Trump and Jeff Sessions, and he suggested reaching out to guess who? Vladimir Putin. Then in April of 2016, Jeff Sessions met with the Russian ambassador, a meeting he would neglect to later mention in a Senate hearing. A few days later, Russian lawmaker Alexander Torshin met Donald Trump Jr. at an NRA dinner in Kentucky. On May 19th, Paul Manafort became the chairman of the Trump campaign, not just a volunteer. And on June 9th, Donald Trump Jr. and Paul Manafort, along with Jared Kushner, met with Russians in that infamous Trump Tower meeting, you know, the one with a promise to get dirt on Hillary Clinton. And as that meeting was being set up, Sater and Cohen at the same time were busy chatting up Putin's press secretary and discussing travel dates, until just after that meeting when Cohen met Sater in the lobby of Trump Tower, saying he could not go to Russia. And it was a very active summer, with Manafort offering a Russian oligarch, quote, private briefings on the campaign in July. And then 2 weeks later, Jeff Sessions, Carter Page, and other Trump officials met with the Russian ambassador at the Republican National Convention, just before the Republican Party platform was changed to weaken the U.S.'s stance on Russia's annexation of Crimea. Remember, the sanctions the United States put on Russia after Crimea was annexed crippled their economy, and their economy remains stressed and under duress since those sanctions were put in place. Putin, he wanted them lifted. Donald Trump, of course, then won the Republican nomination. Joining me now, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance and NBC News investigations reporter Tom Winter. All right, Tom. We have more of a timeline, but what else did we get from yesterday's filing and President Trump's response? Because the thing that I don't get is President Trump is calling Michael Cohen a weak liar and a loser, but Rudy Giuliani, Trump's attorney, is saying that Trump's written answers match Cohen's answers. So which is it? He's a liar and a loser, or they're in lockstep?
I'm so glad you brought that point up, because that's the thing that I've been trying to understand for the last 24 hours, which is essentially, if you're going to say somebody's a liar, but then at the same point you're going to say, well, okay, but my answers match what he's now saying, does that mean that all along the president has actually said, well, no, we continued the conversations? I mean, is this what he's told his attorneys, and is this what he actually told the special counsel's office, which is, hey, yeah, all along, no, we had these discussions going into June of 2016. I mean, I think the other thing that did not come out in the court paperwork yesterday is when Michael Cohen had these additional conversations besides the 3 that he had with Donald Trump. We know that there were additional conversations. That's what Michael Cohen has pled guilty to. We don't know when they were, and we don't know how many additional conversations that we had. So, sometimes we can learn a lot from court documents, but other times we can learn a lot as far as what's not in them. What other details are still missing. So I think that's an important thing that we need to start paying attention to. But really, it's just a question at this point. You have a president who said, I have nothing to do with Russia. And now you have him tweeting this morning, well, I lightly discussed a deal. You're already starting to see some inconsistencies as it relates to this Moscow project, not only by Michael Cohen, he's pled guilty to that, but the president now making the statement that he did on Twitter today.
A conversation light, a deal with less calories, I'm assuming. Okay, Joyce, the president is employing sort of his classic punchback strategy, calling the accuser, I guess you would say, a liar, insisting that Trump himself was never hiding anything. And then the third leg, even if I was hiding something, it's legal, so I'm allowed to do it. So the president is very comfortable doing things that are unusual, maybe unethical. If it's illegal, that's where the problem is. Do you see anything here touching illegality?
There's a lot of potential illegality here. Probably the biggest chunk would be if there's an issue with this story that we heard last night, that there had been a promise of a $50 million penthouse to Putin if the Trump-Moscow project went forward. But there are a lot of ifs surrounding that, Stephanie. For prosecutors, the devil is always in the details. There's a law in this country, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that makes it illegal to pay a bribe to someone in a foreign country to facilitate your business dealings.
But since the deal never happened, since there is no Trump Tower Moscow, will that constitute anything?
Sure, and that's the kind of questions that prosecutors walk through, because it can also be illegal to enter into a conspiracy to do something that you don't actually do. It can even be illegal to make an attempt in certain circumstances, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has a provision like that. That's all to say this is all very complicated and murky for us right now, but I thought Tom really said something important. We often learn as much from what's not in pleadings as from what's in them. What I learned yesterday is that Bob Mueller has a complete deck of cards. He's laying them down as he needs them to move various cases forward. There's a lot left in his hand that we don't know about yet.
We haven't talked about Roger Stone in a few days. Where does he fit into all of this, Tom?
Well, as far as specifically to what we saw with Michael Cohen in federal court yesterday, he doesn't quite get into those proceedings, but I think you bring up a really good point, because for the last several days, we've been really kind of hot and heavy on Roger Stone, his associates, Dr. Jerome Corsi, Randy Credico. We've been talking about all these people that seem to have either the most incredible luck in the world and to have seen these WikiLeaks coming and to see that John Podesta's emails were hacked, or they had some foreknowledge. We don't have all the evidence that obviously federal prosecutors and investigators likely have, but I think that this is something that we'll definitely hear a lot more about. Why? Because it's one of the few things that Robert Mueller has not addressed in his indictment so far. He's directly addressed the hacking, he's directly addressed the troll farms, and any sort of allusions to WikiLeaks have been kind of on the periphery. And we know that his mandate is to talk about Russian interference in the election. Well, you've got in early October Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman's emails being leaked and being put out on WikiLeaks. And according to the indictments, those were taken by the Russians. So we really need to kind of check that box, if you will, from a standpoint of learning more information about it. That speaks directly to Robert Mueller's mandate. So I suspect that we'll be hearing a lot more in the coming weeks and perhaps months as far as who are these guys, what might they have actually known, did anybody tell them about the hacks that WikiLeaks had the information, and then the most important question as it relates ultimately to this question of collusion, cooperation, conspiracy, whatever you want to call it, is did these guys tell somebody in the Trump campaign, hey, Podesta's emails were hacked, WikiLeaks has got them, and is there any then further discussion as far as, hey, we need to release them at a certain point, because as we know, it was within hours of the infamous Access Hollywood tape that has the president on it discussing essentially a sexual assault, that it was within hours of that John Podesta's emails appeared on WikiLeaks, started to appear on WikiLeaks. So I think that's going to be, those are the real two key questions. Did they know in advance? Did they tell the Trump campaign? And was there any further discussion from there? That's something that we're going to have to watch closely in the coming days and weeks.
Joyce, quickly, we're talking a lot about Paul Manafort and his sentencing. This week, when his plea deal blew up, because we learned he and his team had been sharing information with Rudy Giuliani, could that prove out to be, while risky, a clever move for Manafort? We knew Robert Mueller was going to move forward to make sure Paul Manafort was in jail for quite some time. But giving the president the kind of assistance and information that he has, is he clearing the path for President Trump to pardon him? It was no accident that Trump did an interview with the New York Post, owned by Rupert Murdoch, and wink, wink, nod, nod says, I could be open to a pardon. I mean, that's the best news Paul Manafort has heard in months.
It's also the worst news Paul Manafort's ever heard, because if in fact what turns out is that there's evidence that the president has used a pardon to make Paul Manafort unavailable as a witness to the government after he signed up and the government learned that he was in possession of relevant information, then we're looking at a witness tampering situation, and everybody involved, maybe with the exception of the president, is going to jail.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.